I never trusted the HOA on our street, but I didn't think they were bold enough to pull something criminal at least not until the night. Someone pounded on our door at midnight, so hard it rattled the hinges. My wife, Mia, stumbled out of bed before I did, half awake and irritated, brushing her hair out of her eyes. I followed behind her but froze as soon as I heard the voices outside. Deep, forceful, sharp. Open up. HOA enforcement inspection. One of them barked, as if he was reading lines from a bad cop movie. I felt my pulse climb because Mia hated confrontation, yet she always tried to handle things without disturbing me unless absolutely necessary. When she cracked open the door, two men shoved their way in, without waiting for permission. They wore dark navy uniforms, cheap ones. The kind you'd get from a costume shop if you didn't tailor closely, and fake badges dangling from lanyards around their necks. Even in dim light, everything about them spelled impostor. They moved around our living room as if they were searching for something, but neither held a clipboard, paperwork, or even a flashlight. You can't just barge in here, Mia snapped, stepping forward, instinctively shielding the framed photos on the wall, pictures of me in uniform, or at least what I used to look like before I retired from the SEALs and grew out my beard. One of the men got in her face instantly, raising his voice like he expected fear to fall out of her. We have authority to inspect suspected violations, he said. The other took out his phone, pretending to take notes, then glanced around suspiciously, as if expecting a pile of explosives in the corner. I stepped up behind Mia, my voice steady but cold. What violations? The men blinked at me, startled. They hadn't expected another adult in the house, especially not someone my size. Mia tried to push one of their hands away. When he reached toward her arm, as if to guide her aside, he reacted by shoving her backward, hard enough that she stumbled into the dining table. That was when my restraint snapped, not because I used to be a Navy SEAL, not because I had spent half my life in conflict zones, but because nobody touches my wife. I moved so fast the imposters didn't even process the shift before I was between them and Mia, planting myself like a wall of steel. Don't touch her, I said, but my voice wasn't raised. It didn't need to be. Real threats know they're in danger the moment the room falls quiet. The taller one clenched his jaw, trying to keep the act going. Sir, this doesn't need to escalate, he said, though his eyes darted nervously over my shoulders, looking for an exit. The shorter one reached for something on his HIPAA radio, or maybe just pretending it was. I didn't give him time to finish the performance. With one swift move, I snatched the fake badge from his neck and held it up in front of his face. This is plastic, I said, and you two just committed home invasion. They panicked instantly, all the false authority melting into sloppy fear. The taller one stepped back, stammering. We were just sent by the HOA president. He told us you were refusing inspections, and the HOA has no authority to enter anyone's home. I cut in. And definitely no authority to hire dress-up goons. The shorter imposter turned toward the door, as if he might bolt. But then, unbelievably, he muttered, "We were told you wouldn't fight back. They said your wife would answer alone." That single line struck something deep inside me, something dangerous, because it confirmed what I'd suspected. This wasn't a random stunt. The HOA had targeted us, or more precisely, targeted Mia, hoping I wouldn't be home. Unfortunately for them, I had taken early leave this month. I stepped forward, blocking the door before they could escape. "Sit down," I ordered. It wasn't a request. They dropped into the couch instantly, like kids caught stealing candy. I kept my distance, but positioned myself so they couldn't make any sudden moves. "Who sent you? And don't think about lying. I know what lying looks like." I could practically see their brains scrambling, weighing escape against survival. The taller one cracked first. "It was President Carver," he blurted. "He said you were breaking multiple HOA regulations. And if we didn't inspect, he'd fine us for not. He promised to handle everything afterward." Mia stiffened behind me. Carver had harassed her repeatedly since we bought this house. Petty violations. Threats, fines, everything short of showing up with a clipboard to measure the color of our grass. But hiring men to intimidate her, that was new. I turned to Mia, who had a bruise already forming on her elbow. She gave me a tiny nod, trusting me completely. That was all I needed. I pulled out my phone and snapped photos of the fake badges, the uniforms, their faces. "You two are going to walk out of this house quietly," I said. If you run, scream, or try to warn Carver, these pictures go straight to the police and the state attorney. The imposters didn't argue. They practically tripped over themselves, rushing out. As soon as the door closed, Mia let out a trembling breath. I wrapped my arms around her, steadying her. "It's okay," I murmured. "I've got this." They made the wrong enemy tonight. Because if the HOA wanted a fight, I would show them what real combat looked like. By morning, the bruise on Mia's arm had darkened into an ugly purple, and every time I looked at it, another thread of anger stitched itself deeper into my chest. She tried to hide it with a sweater, insisting she didn't want to start drama, but the truth was she hated conflict more than anything. That was one reason we moved here 2 years ago. Quiet streets, friendly neighbors, slow mornings. At least, that was the promise on the brochure. What we got instead was an HOA president who treated the neighborhood like his personal kingdom. Carver was the type of man who loved rules because they made him feel powerful, the type who looked for problems even where none existed. He nitpicked everything from the tint on our windows to the color of our mailbox post. But last night proved something important. He wasn't just power-hungry. He was desperate. Desperate enough to send 2 idiots in costume to intimidate my wife. I made us breakfast, though neither of us truly tasted anything. Mia kept glancing at the door, flinching every time a car drove by. I knew that feeling, being shaken, unsure, waiting for something bad to happen again. I'd seen it in villages overseas, in families displaced by violence, and now I was seeing it in the woman I loved because of a man who thought running an HOA made him a warlord. "We should report it now," she said finally. Her voice was small but steady. "Those men, the HOA. Everything." I nodded, but I also knew this wasn't something to rush. Not yet. I had the rule, never strike before you understand the battlefield. Carver had crossed the line, but the way he did it bothered me. Those 2 imposters weren't professionals. They were scared, sloppy, untrained. That meant Carver had recruited them from somewhere nearby. Neighbors, friends, maybe other HOA members tired of his threats. I wanted to know who else was involved. I walked outside to check the perimeter, not because I expected trouble, but because habit never dies. Our yard was neat, simple, well within regulations. Yet a neon orange notice flapped on our mailbox like an insult. Urgent violation notice. Unauthorized exterior alterations. Alterations. We hadn't touched the yard in weeks. I ripped the paper down and headed straight for the HOA office at the end of the block. The HOA office was actually a repurposed 2-car garage connected to Carver's house. He'd turned it into a shrine to his own authority, laminated rule sheets on the walls, security monitors showing every street corner, and a massive desk that looked like it belonged in a law firm. Carver himself was inside, typing aggressively on a laptop. He looked up when I entered, his face tightening as if he'd bitten into something rotten. "You can't just barge in," he snapped. "This is official HOA property." I closed the door behind me quietly. "We need to talk," I said. My voice was calm enough to make him uneasy. "About the 2 men you sent to my house last night." His jaw twitched, but otherwise he stayed still. "Too still? I don't know what you're implying." I stepped closer. "2 fake cops assaulted my wife. They said you sent them." Carver scoffed, leaning back in his oversized chair. "And you believe them, please?" "Probably intruders. You should have called real authorities." That should have been a reasonable response, but everything about his body language was off. He avoided eye contact, tapped his thumb against his desk repeatedly, and glanced twice toward a file drawer near his knee. I followed the glance. "What's in the drawer, Carver?" I asked. His eyes widened. "None of your business." Which, in my world, translated directly to, exactly my business. I stepped around his desk in one fluid move, and Carver scrambled to block me, but he was too slow. I pulled the drawer open and froze. Inside was a stack of envelopes, dozens each, with a different neighbor's name written on them. Emergency enforcement assignments. The labels read. I opened one. It contained a list of tasks that looked more like intimidation orders. Conduct after-hours inspection. Enforce payment reminder aggressively. Verify nighttime compliance. These weren't official HOA duties, they were scare tactics. Carver snatched the paper from my hand. "You have no authority. You sent those men because they were on your list," I interrupted. You're running a little militia here. His face reddened. This neighborhood has been falling apart. People ignore rules, do whatever they want. Someone has to take charge. I stared at him, stunned by the delusion. So you're running your kingdom by terrorizing residents. He slammed his fist on the desk. Order requires pressure. You military types should appreciate that. He meant it as a jab, but all it did was confirm how little he understood about real leadership. I leaned down until our faces were inches apart. You made one mistake, Carver. You thought you could scare my wife. Carver stiffened. If you go to the police with lies, I'll make sure you regret it. I smiled not because it was funny, but because he had no idea what line he just crossed. I don't need lies, I said. I have evidence, and after last night, you just gave me motive. His confidence cracked, panic leaking through the edges like water through broken glass. On the walk home, I planned everything, gathering statements, tracking down the imposters, documenting every violation Carver manufactured, and exposing his entire operation. Mia met me at the door, searching my face. What now? She asked. I kissed her forehead gently. Now we take down the HOA. The first step in taking down a man like Carver was understanding just how far his reach extended. It's easy to underestimate small tyrants. They don't roar like dictators, but they whisper like termite sand. Before you know it, the structure around you is infested. Carver had woven himself into the neighborhood so thoroughly that even people who hated him still feared him. I knew intimidation when I saw it. I'd seen warlords, cartel lieutenants, corrupt officials. They all used the same playbook. Fear first, obedience second. Mia sat on the couch holding a warm mug between her hands when I returned home. She looked calmer, though exhaustion clung to her like a shadow. Did you get anything? She asked softly. I sat beside her, taking her hand. He's running a private intimidation network, I said. Assignments, tasks, lists. He's been coercing residents into helping him enforce his rules. Her eyes widened. You mean our neighbors? Yes, I said, and I want to know which of them agreed willingly and which were scared into it. But what if they were all scared? She whispered. Then they need protecting. I answered, and someone has to be the first to stand up. I could see the conflict in her eyes. Mia wasn't built for confrontation, but she wasn't weak. She'd always carried strength quietly, like an ember instead of a flame. Last night's assault had shaken her, but it hadn't broken her. What do you need me to do? She asked, surprising me. Just be honest, I said. Your story matters. We started with the closest house, Mr. Hollis, a retired librarian who lived alone and rarely left except to tend to his roses. He opened the door cautiously when he saw us approaching. The chain still hooked. Everything all right? He asked. We need to talk about the HOA, I said gently. The chain slid off immediately. Come in. His living room smelled like old paper and lemon cleaner. He motioned for us to sit, but remained standing, wringing his hands. You're not here about last night, are you? At that, Mia and I exchanged a quick look. What do you know about last night? She asked. Hollis sank into an armchair, as if his legs suddenly failed him. Carver's men, they came here 2 weeks ago. He described it quietly. Pounding on the door, demanding entrance, accusing him of wasting community water, because his sprinklers ran 5 minutes past the allowed time. When he resisted, they threatened fines so steep he'd lose his home. Carver later pretended it was all a misunderstanding, but Hollis knew better. They're not real officers, I told him. I figured as much, he whispered. But I'm old. I didn't know what to do. You could have called the police, Mia said, though not unkindly. I was afraid, Hollis admitted. Carver said if I caused trouble, he'd have the board vote to impose mandatory compliance inspections. I thought he could ruin me. My jaw tightened. This wasn't just petty HOA meddling. This was systematic manipulation. We visited 4 more houses that afternoon. A young couple bullied for having a hammock in their backyard. A single mother threatened over noise violations that turned out to be her daughter practicing violin. A man recovering from surgery accused of abandoning his lawn while bedridden. Every story had a thread that led right back to Carver, and behind each one was fear. By sunset, Mia looked pale and tired. I guided her back inside, fed her dinner, and watched her swallow it quietly. It's everywhere, she murmured. Everyone's scared. That's why this ends now, I replied. Night settled in slowly. The house grew quiet. I sat at the dining table with my laptop open, compiling everything: names, statements, timestamps, photos, the fake badges, evidence, structure, organization. If there was one thing the military drilled into me, it was the art of building a case that could survive pressure. Around midnight, I sensed movement outside, quiet footsteps on gravel, too soft for normal traffic, too deliberate for a random passerby. I stood silently, hand instinctively sliding under the table where I kept a secured tactical flashlight, heavy metal, dual purpose. Through the window, I saw the shadow of a man pacing near our mailbox. Then another figure appeared. They weren't wearing uniforms this time. They were trying to be subtle: dark hoodies, gloved hands, staying out of the street lights. They hadn't come to talk. They'd come to sabotage. I moved quickly and quietly, stepping outside before they noticed the door open. The taller one knelt near our mailbox, pulling out a wrench and a small metal device, some kind of lock jammer. The shorter one kept watch. I was 10 feet away before they realized I was there. "What are you doing?" I asked. They whipped around, startled. The shorter one cursed under his breath and reached for something in his pocket. But I didn't give him the chance to pull it out. I stepped forward, knocking his hand aside and twisting his wrist until he yelped and dropped whatever he was holding. It clattered on the pavement. "Just a can of spray paint." "Vandalism," I said. "That's the level we're at now." The taller man stammered. We were just told to mark your house for violation warnings." Carver said. "You refused to cooperate." "Cooperate with what?" I snapped. "He said you were dangerous," the man whispered. "Said you were threatening the neighborhood." I almost laughed at the absurdity. "Did he tell you what happened last night?" They exchanged nervous glances. "He said you attacked 2 inspectors, that your wife exaggerated everything." My blood boiled, but anger wouldn't help here. Clarity would. "Go home," I said. "Tell Carver nothing." The shorter man rubbed his wrist. "Why should we listen to you?" "Because if you don't," I said, stepping closer, "the next time you're out here, you'll be facing police officers. Real ones." They didn't need more convincing. They bolted. Inside, Mia waited anxiously at the door. "What happened?" "Carver sent more people," I said, locking it behind me. Her voice trembled. "Why is he doing this?" "Because he knows he's losing," I replied. "Bullies get loudest right before they fall." And Carver was about to fall hard. The next morning, I started mapping out every detail. Carver had made a mistake in relying on fear. He assumed no one would speak up, no one would challenge his authority. But he hadn't counted on the fact that I knew how to fight carefully, how to gather evidence and leverage it. Unlike his imposters, I understood the battlefield both legally and strategically. Our mission was clear: expose him, protect the neighborhood, and make sure Mia never had to live in fear again. I began by calling a few of the neighbors we had already spoken to: Hollies, the young couple with the hammock, the single mother. Each one was initially hesitant. "What if he finds out?" they asked. "What if he retaliates?" But I assured them that every step would be carefully documented. "We're not acting recklessly," I said. "We're collecting proof, and once we have it, he'll have nowhere to hide." Slowly, hesitantly, they agreed to participate, giving me their statements in writing and detailing every encounter with Carver's harassment. Mia insisted on helping. She typed up the accounts, organized the photographs of the fake badges and imposters, and kept a list of the nightly disturbances we had already witnessed. Watching her work, I realized that the strength she carried quietly was going to be our secret weapon. She had a presence that demanded attention without needing to raise her voice, a skill that Carver's minions clearly lacked. While I could intimidate when necessary, Mia's calm authority would serve as the backbone of our neighborhood coalition. By the 3rd day, we had enough evidence to outline a clear pattern: intimidation, false claims, trespassing, and threats, all systematically used to consolidate Carver's power over the residents. But before we presented it to the authorities, I knew we needed to confirm one thing: just how deep did his network run? Who else was helping him, and which residents were involved against their will? Late that evening, I staked out the HOA office, hiding in the shadows. I saw two men, probably some of the same imposters from before, arriving quietly. They slipped inside, and I caught snippets of their conversation through the cracked window. "He said the Wilson house tonight," one whispered. "Check that backyard for unauthorized activity." They laughed nervously, not realizing that their actions were now under surveillance. I snapped several photos and took careful notes of their faces and movements. The HOA wasn't just a nuisance anymore. It had become an organized operation of fear. Returning home, I felt a sense of purpose that I hadn't felt in a long time. Mia greeted me at the door, her eyes alert. "Any news?" she asked. I nodded, confirmed. "More of Carver's men are active tonight. We know who they are. We know where they operate from, and we have proof of every move." Her lips pressed together, a mixture of pride and concern. "What's next?" she asked. I paused, considering. "Next, we make him realize he can't intimidate anyone, not even us. We do this smart, step by step." The following morning, I made discreet phone calls to local authorities. I didn't want to act rashly, but the evidence was irrefutable. Home invasions, impersonation of law enforcement, intimidation, and harassment. I scheduled a meeting with the local sheriff, bringing Mia along for support. When we arrived, I laid out the photographs, the statements, and the surveillance notes. The sheriff leaned back, clearly impressed by the thoroughness. "You've got a strong case here," he said. "We can't ignore this." Relieved but cautious, I left the sheriff's office with Mia, knowing that the fight was far from over. Carver had underestimated us, and once he realized that law enforcement was involved, he would likely escalate. But this time, we were ready. We had allies, evidence, and a strategy. The HOA president's bluff had been called, and there was no turning back. That night, we held a secret meeting with the neighbors, who were willing to stand against Carver. Around a dining table illuminated by a single lamp, we shared information, coordinated statements, and discussed how to document any further intimidation attempts. The room hummed with quiet determination. Fear still lingered in the corners, but courage was beginning to fill the space. I glanced at Mia, who was quietly guiding the discussion. Her composure, her ability to make people feel safe while insisting they act, was remarkable. This was no longer just about defending our home, it was about reclaiming the neighborhood. Later, after everyone left, I and Mia sat on the porch, the night still and watchful around us. "Do you think it'll work?" she asked softly. I reached for her hand. "It has to," I said. "Carver has played a dangerous game, and now the rules have changed. He doesn't just threaten, Uzi, threatens the entire community. We're going to make sure he can't do that anymore." She nodded, her eyes reflecting the faint glow of the streetlight. "I trust you," she whispered. And in that moment, I realized that trust was more powerful than fear. It would be our greatest weapon. As the night deepened, I knew that Carver would strike back soon. But I was ready. Every move, every intimidation tactic he had used, had been catalogued, and every weak link in his network had been identified. The final confrontation would be calculated, precise, and unrelenting. The HOA president had no idea that the quiet Navy SEAL next door and his determined wife were about to dismantle his empire of fear. The calm after our neighbor meetings didn't last long. Carver wasn't the type to accept defeat quietly. Within 2 days, strange incidents began happening around the neighborhood. Trash bins were overturned, spray-painted warnings appeared on driveways, and a few residents received threatening phone calls. It was subtle enough to maintain plausible deniability, but blatant enough to send a message. He wasn't done, and he intended to fight dirty. I monitored each incident carefully. Every scrap of evidence was logged, every threat noted. Mia stayed close by, making sure the neighbors remained calm, offering reassurance and practical guidance. "Don't react to their intimidation," she told Hollis, who'd grown increasingly anxious. "Document it. Keep your statements consistent. It strengthens our case." Her calm authority had begun to spread through the neighborhood like a quiet contagion. People were slowly learning that they had the right to defend themselves, not with violence, but with proof. Carver, of course, had no clue how thorough we had become. He assumed that fear would still control us, that last night's incident outside our house had been an isolated scare tactic. He didn't realize that the neighborhood now had a network-coordinated effort to counter his threats. By the time he realized it, it would be too late. That evening, as I checked the surveillance footage, I saw 2 more of his impostors attempting to sneak onto my property. They approached from the side alley, trying to avoid the street lights. I quietly alerted Mia and instructed her to stay inside while I confronted them. I didn't want another physical altercation unless it was unavoidable, but the lesson from last encounter was clear. Bluffing or hesitation could be dangerous. As I stepped outside, the figures froze. The taller one raised his hands, clearly startled by my calm but commanding presence. We were just checking," he stammered. "Checking what?" I asked, stepping closer. The sprinkler system," he muttered. His eyes darted nervously, betraying the lie. "You've been part of Carver's intimidation tactics," I sighed flatly. "I know your names. I know your assignments. Go home, or the authorities will be called." They didn't wait for a second warning. They bolted, disappearing into the shadows. I watched them go, making mental notes of the timing and direction, adding every detail to our growing dossier. Mia had been watching from the window, her hand resting lightly on the frame. I could see the tension in her shoulders, but also pride. She had the rare ability to stand alongside me without needing to act violently, simply by presence and strategy. The following morning, Carver showed up at the edge of our property in persona, bold and brazen move. He strutted onto the sidewalk, clipboard in hand, as if that gave him authority. "You've been causing trouble," he called out, his voice carrying 2 nearby houses. "This is harassment of HOA property." I stepped onto the porch, folding my arms. "You're threatening neighbors and sending imposters onto their property," I said. "Those actions are criminal, and we have documented proof." Carver's face reddened. "That's ridiculous." "Not at all," I said. "We have photographs, statements, and witnesses, and it's only a matter of time before law enforcement reviews everything. You can still avoid further escalation if you walk away." His lips pressed into a thin line, frustration and anger battling for dominance on his face. I could almost see him calculating, wondering whether to retreat or escalate further. The choice was his, but in the end, he had underestimated me from the very start. By noon, the sheriff returned my call and scheduled a formal interview with all the neighbors who had experienced harassment. Carver was unaware that the network of residents, quietly coordinating through emails and phone messages, had agreed to present their accounts simultaneously. This would amplify the evidence and make it impossible for him to manipulate the narrative or intimidate individuals into silence. Meanwhile, Mia and I worked on compiling a chronological timeline. Every visit by imposters, every threat, every false violation notice was logged with names, times, and photographic or video proof. This wasn't just evidence, it was a story of pattern, intent, and misconduct. By presenting a coherent story, we ensured that Carver couldn't hide behind bureaucratic excuses. That evening, after finalizing the documents, I walked Mia through the plan. "Tomorrow, the sheriff interviews everyone," I said. "We let the facts speak, not emotions. We stay calm, consistent, and coordinated. Carver's lies will crumble under scrutiny." Mia nodded, her eyes steely. "He won't intimidate us anymore," she said. "Not tonight," I agreed. "Not ever again." I watched her close the laptop and lean back, exhausted but resolute. Outside, the neighborhood seemed quiet, but the calm was deceptive. The storm had already begun. Carver's move to strike back only confirmed one thing. He recognized our power, and he feared it. That fear would be our leverage. As we prepared for the next day, I knew that the coming confrontation would be decisive. Carver had made the first mistake, underestimating the people he thought he controlled. And now, with strategy, evidence, and a united front, we were ready to turn the tables completely. For the first time since last week's attack, I allowed myself a small smile. Carver didn't know it yet, but his empire of fear was about to collapse, and the Navy SEAL next door would make sure of it. The following morning, the neighborhood was tense, but a subtle undercurrent of resolve ran through it. I arrived early at Hollis's house, where several neighbors had agreed to gather before the scheduled sheriff interview. Each person carried a small notebook or folder, quietly reviewing notes and statements. There was fear still lingering in their eyes, but also determination. This was the first time in months or years that they felt they had someone standing beside them who understood how to handle Carver's intimidation tactics. Mia joined me quietly, moving between residents. reassuring them and ensuring every account was complete. She had a calming presence that seemed to settle nerves instantly. Focus on facts, not opinions. She reminded one of the younger neighbors, who fidgeted nervously with a pen. Stick to what happened, when it happened, and who was involved. That's all that matters. Her voice was firm but gentle, and I could see the shift in their demeanor. Fear was being replaced by confidence. By mid-morning, the sheriff arrived with 2 deputies. He was composed, professional, and immediately put the group at ease. I briefed him on the situation, summarizing Carver's harassment tactics, the imposters, the fake violations, and the threats that had escalated over the past 2 weeks. Mia added details regarding the coordinated documentation, showing how every resident's account corroborated the others. The sheriff nodded gravely, clearly impressed by the thoroughness and organization. When it came time for the interviews, each neighbor spoke clearly, calmly, and consistently. They detailed the unauthorized entries by Carver's men, the threats, the vandalism, and the repeated harassment. Statements were backed with photos, surveillance footage, and even timestamps from phone records. Carver had tried to fragment and isolate residents, but this coordinated approach had turned the tables completely. Each neighbor's courage reinforced the others, creating a chain of truth that Carver could not break. Meanwhile, Mia and I remained outside in case anyone tried to interfere. A few suspicious cars drove slowly down the street, but none approached. It was clear that Carver's usual tactics, intimidation, distraction, misdirection, were being neutralized by preparation and solidarity. His reign of fear was weakening with every recorded statement, every photograph, every neighbor standing tall. By late afternoon, the sheriff had collected all evidence, made notes, and promised swift action. He explained the next steps: a formal investigation into Carver's conduct, potential charges for harassment, home invasion, impersonation, and intimidation, and a possible restraining order to prevent him from contacting the residents further. The neighbors exhaled collectively, a mix of relief and pride. For the first time, they realized that Carver's power relied entirely on fear and that fear had no place here anymore. When we returned home, Mia and I sat on the porch, sharing a quiet moment. "They did well," she said softly. "Everyone came through." "They did," I agreed. "And they learned something even more important: they're not alone." Her hand found mine, fingers intertwining. "Do you think Carver will back down now?" "I hope so," I replied. "But even if he doesn't, we're ready." Later that evening, a new threat appeared. A letter slid under our door, unsigned, but unmistakably Carver's style. It was terse and menacing. "You think you've won? You've made powerful enemies. Watch your back." I read it aloud to Mia, who listened calmly but with a steely edge. "Empty threats," she said. "He has no leverage left, and we have everything he can't take away. Evidence and witnesses." I nodded. She was right. Carver's intimidation only worked if people were afraid, and fear was no longer a weapon in our neighborhood. The chain of truth we had built was stronger than any threat he could issue. The next few days were a mix of tension and vigilance. I continued to monitor surveillance cameras while also keeping a close eye on Carver's activities. He had started to move more cautiously, sending fewer imposters, and trying to act as if nothing had happened. But every time he did, I noted it, every detail going into a growing dossier that would make his actions undeniable in court. Mia and I also worked on compiling a comprehensive timeline that included all incidents, photographic evidence, and sworn statements. Every night, she double-checked every fact, her meticulousness ensuring there would be no loopholes for Carver to exploit. By the end of the week, the neighborhood felt different. People spoke more openly in their yards, greeted each other without hesitation, and shared stories of resistance that had been quietly building over the past weeks. What had begun as fear was transforming into a collective sense of empowerment. And in the center of it all, Mia and I were quietly orchestrating the strategy that had turned neighbors from isolated victims into a united front. As night fell, I looked out at the street, watching shadows stretch across lawns that had once felt hostile. The calm was deceptive. We knew Carver was plotting his next move. But this time, we were not alone, and we were prepared. The tide had shifted, and Carver's empire of fear was on borrowed time. Mia leaned against my shoulder, whispering, "We've already won in more ways than one." I smiled, feeling the weight of the past week lift slightly. "We've only just begun," I replied. "And next, we finish what we started." By the following week, Carver had grown increasingly desperate. His subtle threats had escalated into bolder attempts to intimidate the neighborhood, but each effort was met with resistance. Surveillance cameras captured his imposters loitering, making notes, and attempting minor acts of vandalism. But now, every move was documented. The sheriff's office was reviewing the evidence, and Carver had no idea that the entire neighborhood had become a coordinated network. I spent the morning walking the streets, checking cameras, and reviewing the compiled evidence with Mia. We knew Carver would try something bigger. He always did, when cornered. The question was when, not if. Every shadow, every late-night movement, every suspicious car was noted and cross-referenced with his known associates. Mia stayed calm throughout, knowing her presence reassured the neighbors and kept them from panicking. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Carver made his move. He arrived in a black SUV with tinted windows, slowly driving past each house as if conducting an inspection. I watched from the porch, counting the moments and noting his patterns. He wasn't subtle anymore. He wanted us to see him, to feel the weight of his authority pressing down. Mia came up beside me, her arm brushing mine. "He's showing off," she said quietly. "He thinks fear will work again." I shook my head. "Not this time. He doesn't know that fear has been replaced by resolve. Everyone is ready." As expected, he stopped outside our house, leaving the SUV running while he stepped onto the sidewalk. He held a clipboard, gesturing dramatically as if he were conducting a serious inspection. His gaze fell on me and Mia, and I could see the irritation flare across his face. He clearly didn't expect us to confront him directly. I stepped onto the porch, standing tall. "Carver," I said, "this ends tonight." He sneered. "You think you can intimidate me? You've caused enough trouble for this neighborhood. I'm in charge here." "You're in charge of nothing," I replied, calm but firm. "Your intimidation tactics, impersonation, and harassment are all documented. Law enforcement is reviewing every incident, and neighbors are ready to testify." His smirk faltered slightly, though he tried to mask it. "You'll regret this," he said, his voice low and threatening. "Actually," I said, taking a step forward, "we'll make sure you regret it." At that moment, several neighbors emerged from their homes, the young couple, the single mother-all, standing quietly but firmly behind us. Carver's eyes widened as he realized he was no longer addressing just me and Mia. He was facing an entire neighborhood united. "You're all going to testify against him?" he demanded, panic creeping into his tone. "Yes," I said. "Every violation, every intimidation, every trespassing incident will be documented in court, and the sheriff already has the evidence." Carver's facade began to crumble. He looked around, realizing that the network of fear he had cultivated was collapsing. "This isn't over," he hissed. "It is over," I said, "and the sooner you understand that, the better for you. Leave now, and no further escalation will be necessary. Stay, and everything goes to the authorities, and the consequences are on you." For a moment, there was silence. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Carver's black SUV sat idling, his minions nowhere in sight. It became clear that he had miscalculated the neighborhood's loyalty, misjudged our resolve, and underestimated Mia and me. He finally slammed the clipboard against the SUV hood, muttered something under his breath, and retreated into the vehicle. The engine roared as he sped down the street, leaving behind a quiet, uneasy peace. Neighbors began to relax, exchanging looks of relief. The collective power of truth and preparation had triumphed over intimidation. Mia leaned against me, her hand brushing mine. "They've seen that we're serious," she said. "Yes," I agreed. "And they've seen that fear no longer rules this street. They've reclaimed their power." We spent the rest of the evening ensuring all security cameras were functioning, that neighbors knew how to report any further harassment, and that documentation continued to be organized. Carver might return, but he would no longer have the element of fear. By nightfall, a sense of calm settled over the neighborhood, a quiet confidence that the residents were truly in control. I stood on the porch with Mia, looking out at the street that had been our battlefield. Lights glimmered from homes, and shadows stretched across lawns that had once felt tense and hostile. Now they felt like a community ready to protect itself. Mia rested her head on my shoulder. "Do you think he'll give up?" she asked softly. Eventually, I replied, but even if he doesn't, he knows the rules have changed. And from this point forward, every move he makes will be watched, recorded, and addressed. The Navy SEAL and his wife aren't the only ones standing up anymore. The night was quiet, but for the first time, it wasn't tense. It was steady, deliberate, and powerful, the calm after the first strike of a battle that had already been won in principle. Carver had no idea that his empire of fear was crumbling, and the neighborhood had gained something far more valuable than mere safety: unity. The calm that had settled over the neighborhood was fragile, but it gave everyone a sense of purpose. Carver had been quiet for a few days, likely regrouping and planning his next move. But we knew his desperation would soon translate into reckless action. Mia and I doubled down on monitoring. Every shadow, every unfamiliar car, every late-night movement was noted, logged, and cross-referenced with prior incidents. The network of neighbors remained alert, exchanging information quietly and efficiently. That evening, the tension that had been building finally erupted. A series of phone calls to multiple residents contained threats more direct than before, warning them of consequences if they continued to participate in what Carver called false accusations. The notes were precise, and the tone was unmistakably his. But this time, instead of fear, the messages prompted anger and resolve. People were tired of hiding, tired of being intimidated, and ready to stand together. I gathered Mia and a few neighbors at our home to discuss the plan for the coming week. We needed a coordinated strategy for responding to Carver's last attempts at intimidation. The sheriff was already aware of his activities, and evidence was mounting. But we could not rely solely on legal channels. The residents needed to know how to protect themselves while staying compliant, ensuring that any act of aggression on Carver's part would be recorded and used as proof. Hollis, the young couple, and the single mother all participated, sharing concerns and ideas. Mia guided the discussion with a calm authority that commanded attention, ensuring that each voice was heard while keeping everyone focused on the goal. The next day, Carver made a bold move. He appeared in front of several homes simultaneously, wielding authority like a weapon, trying to intimidate through presence alone. But instead of retreating, the residents stood their ground. Some filmed the encounter on their phones, others recorded audio of his threats. Every intimidation tactic he had relied on for months now worked against him. By the time the sheriff's deputies arrived alerted in advance by our documentation, Carver was caught in the act. His anger was evident, his usual composure replaced by frustration and panic. We watched from a safe distance as deputies confronted him. Carver tried to talk his way out of it, claiming misunderstandings and false claims. But the evidence was overwhelming. Statements from neighbors, photographs, videos, and surveillance logs left no room for manipulation. The deputies listened patiently, confirming that every detail aligned with the documented pattern of harassment. Carver's minions, now under scrutiny themselves, began distancing themselves from his influence. The empire of fear he had spent months building was collapsing piece by piece. After the deputies left with Carver, Mia and I returned to our porch, exhausted but triumphant. "It's finally over," she said softly. I nodded, though I knew there would still be follow-up, court proceedings, and legal battles. But the most critical step had been taken. Carver could no longer intimidate the neighborhood. People had reclaimed their streets and their sense of safety. Over the next few days, the community began to heal. Residents spoke freely in their yards, exchanged stories, and rebuilt connections that had been strained under Carver's reign. The sense of empowerment was tangible. No longer were they victims of an oppressive HOA precedent. They were witnesses, participants, and protectors of a community united. Mia and I continued to support them quietly, answering questions, reviewing incidents, and making sure documentation was accurate. The sheriff informed us that charges for harassment, impersonation, and intimidation were formally filed against Carver. Restraining orders prevented him from contacting any residents, and law enforcement monitored his movements closely. The legal system was finally aligned with the neighborhood's collective voice, and every piece of evidence we had collected became a cornerstone in building the case. One evening, as the sun set across the street, Mia and I walked the neighborhood together. Lights glimmered in the windows, and the air was lighter than it had been in months. Neighbors waved from porches, children played without fear, and the quiet hum of life returned. The long weeks of preparation, surveillance, and careful strategy had culminated in a decisive victory not just for us, but for every resident who had once felt powerless. Mia squeezed my hand. Do you think anyone will try to step in and take over now? She asked. I shook my head. The difference now is that the community is awake. They won't let anyone like Carver dictate their lives again. We've set a precedent. She smiled, the weight of relief on her shoulders finally visible. It feels good to see them confident again. I agreed. It's not just confidence. It's freedom, the kind that comes from standing together and refusing to be intimidated. As we continued our walk, I realized that this experience had changed more than the neighborhood. It had changed Mia and me as well. The trials we had faced, the fear we had overcome, and the strength we had discovered in each other had forged a new sense of resilience. The community's victory was our victory, and it was one built on preparation, courage, and unwavering support. By the time we returned home, night had fallen, and the streets were calm. Mia rested her head on my shoulder as we looked out over the quiet neighborhood. Carver's last stand had failed, and the neighborhood had reclaimed its peace. The lights from the homes flickered softly in the darkness, symbolizing a community that had faced fear, united against it, and emerged stronger. And for the first time in months, we allowed ourselves to feel the full weight of relief. The battle was won, but more importantly, the community had learned that fear could be confronted and defeated when people stood together. The days after Carver's failed intimidation were tense but quiet. He had retreated, visibly shaken, but the community remained vigilant. Every resident knew that his attempts to regain control would be futile. Mia and I continued monitoring activity on the streets, checking cameras, and reviewing any suspicious behavior. Even though Carver had been restrained by law enforcement, we weren't taking any chances. The neighborhood had grown stronger, more coordinated, and determined to protect its hard-won peace. The sheriff's office called to inform us that a formal investigation into Carver's conduct had begun. The charges included harassment, impersonation of law enforcement, intimidation, and trespassing. Mia and I provided additional evidence, detailed logs, photographs, timestamps, and neighbor statements. The weight of proof was overwhelming, and law enforcement confirmed that Carver could face serious legal consequences if the case went to court. For the first time, it seemed that justice might truly be served. Residents began to regain a sense of normalcy. Children played in yards without fear. Neighbors spoke openly on sidewalks, and the sense of unity was palpable. Many approached Mia and me with gratitude, sharing stories of how empowered they felt after standing up together. Fear had been replaced by confidence. The community had discovered that, united, they could confront intimidation and survive it stronger than before. It wasn't just legal protection that mattered. It was the knowledge that they were no longer alone. Carver, on the other hand, appeared increasingly isolated. Rumors circulated that some of his associates had begun distancing themselves, unwilling to be involved in further illegal actions. His influence over the HOA was crumbling, and the reputation he had cultivated for fear and control was disintegrating. Every attempt to rally support within the neighborhood failed, leaving him frustrated and powerless. One evening, the sheriff called for a formal meeting with all residents who had provided evidence. Mia and I arrived early to coordinate and ensure everyone felt comfortable. The room was filled with neighbors, each carrying their documentation, ready to share accounts of harassment and intimidation. Hollis, the young couple, and several others were present, their confidence palpable. The sheriff explained the process, emphasizing the importance of clear, consistent statements. Each neighbor spoke in turn, providing details of Carver's illegal activities. The consistency of their accounts, combined with photographic and video evidence, left no doubt about the extent of his misconduct. Carver did not attend the meeting. His absence was telling. He had no ability to counter the overwhelming evidence, no witnesses to protect him, and no authority to intimidate the participants. Every threat he had used previously now worked against him, creating a compelling case that law enforcement could not ignore. The sense of justice in the room was tangible. Neighbors exchanged relieved glances, silently acknowledging the power of truth over fear. After the meeting, Mia and I walked home together, reflecting on the events of the past weeks. It's strange, she said, how quickly things can change when people refuse to be afraid. I nodded. Fear is only powerful if it's allowed to dominate. Once you confront it, you take control, and that control spreads to others. She smiled, squeezing my hand. We've done more than protect ourselves. We've shown everyone here that intimidation doesn't last. The next morning, news spread that Carver's HOA position had been suspended pending further investigation. Official notices cited harassment and illegal intimidation practices. The residents were elated, knowing that a man who had ruled through fear no longer held authority. The neighborhood felt safer, not just because Carver was restrained, but because people had witnessed what could happen when they stood together. Mia and I spent the following week assisting neighbors in organizing community meetings. The focus was on rebuilding trust, improving security, and ensuring that no one could ever manipulate or intimidate them again. Lights were repaired, fences strengthened, and a neighborhood watch established. It wasn't just about prevention. It was about creating a resilient, empowered community capable of standing against anyone who might attempt to harm it. As the days passed, Carver's influence dwindled further. Legal notices arrived, restraining orders were enforced, and law enforcement made it clear that continued harassment would result in immediate consequences. The man who had once dominated the neighborhood through fear was now powerless, a cautionary example of what happens when intimidation meets preparation, courage, and unity. One evening, Mia and I stood on our porch, looking out over the street. Lights glimmered in homes, children laughed in yards, and neighbors spoke freely to one another. The calm was no longer deceptive, it was earned. Carver's last attempts at control had failed, and the neighborhood had reclaimed its streets, its sense of safety, and its pride. Mia rested her head on my shoulder. "We've done it," she whispered. "They're finally free." I smiled, feeling a deep satisfaction. "Yes," I said, "and they've learned something even more important. They can protect themselves together." The struggle had been long, tense, and at times frightening, but the lessons endured. Fear could be confronted, power could be reclaimed, and the neighborhood had proven that when a community stands united, even the most relentless intimidation cannot prevail. The following week brought a new sense of momentum. Carver's suspension had created an opening for change, and the neighborhood was ready to seize it. Meetings with law enforcement became routine, as the sheriff's office worked to ensure that every report, photograph, and witness statement was properly catalogued. Mia and I continued to support neighbors, helping them organize documents, verify timelines, and prepare for any eventual court proceedings. The process was meticulous, but it gave everyone a sense of control they had not felt in months. Carver, predictably, attempted minor provocations, suspicious cars, driving slowly down streets. Anonymous notes slipped under doors, but each act was recorded, logged, and reported immediately. The fear that had once gripped the community had been replaced with vigilance and confidence. Neighbors spoke openly, exchanged stories of past harassment, and collaborated on security measures. Every failed attempt by Carver to intimidate reinforced their unity and resilience. The sheriff's office arranged interviews with several residents for formal statements. Mia and I guided them through the process, emphasizing the importance of clarity, consistency, and composure. Each neighbor recounted experiences of intimidation, trespassing, and harassment, while providing supporting evidence. The strength of the collective narrative left no room for doubt. Carver's misconduct was deliberate, coordinated, and sustained over months. His influence and control, once feared, were now shattered. Meanwhile, Carver's frustration became increasingly evident. Rumors spread that he had tried to enlist support from other HOA members, but most refused to risk legal consequences. Isolation replaced the authority he once wielded so easily. Every effort to regain power only highlighted how much he had underestimated the neighborhood's resilience. His reputation as a figure of fear was eroding, and his attempts at manipulation now backfired, providing further evidence for law enforcement. One afternoon, Mia and I met with the sheriff to review the compiled case files. The photographs, videos, statements, and timestamps formed a compelling narrative, clearly documenting a pattern of intimidation. The sheriff nodded gravely. "This is strong," he said. "Carver's actions leave little room for defense. Once we proceed, it's likely he will face significant legal consequences." I felt a surge of relief and pride. Months of planning, monitoring, and coordinating had culminated in a case that could not be dismissed. At the same time, the community began taking proactive steps to reinforce safety and cohesion. A neighborhood watch was established, schedules for shared surveillance were organized, and emergency protocols were shared among residents. The emphasis was not just on defense, but on empowerment. People were learning that preparedness, communication, and collaboration were more powerful than fear, and the lessons would endure long after Carver's influence had faded. Carver's next move was predictable in its desperation. He attempted to send a final anonymous threat to Mia and me, warning of consequences if we continued our efforts. But this time, the note was met with laughter rather than fear. We photographed the letter, documented its delivery, and reported it to the sheriff. The law now reinforced what the neighborhood had already discovered. Intimidation had no place here. Carver's power was gone, and every action he took only strengthened the case against him. The days leading to the formal filing of charges were filled with quiet anticipation. Neighbors continued daily routines, but now, with a renewed sense of ownership over their streets. Children played freely, couples walked their dogs without concern, and casual conversations on sidewalks replaced the whispered fears that had once dominated the neighborhood. Mia and I observed these changes with satisfaction, knowing that our efforts had created a lasting impact. Finally, the day arrived when formal charges were filed. Carver faced multiple counts of harassment, intimidation, trespassing, and impersonation of law enforcement. Restraining orders were officially enforced, preventing him from contacting any residents or attempting further intimidation. The sheriff confirmed that law enforcement would closely monitor compliance, and any violation would result in immediate arrest. The message was clear. Carver could no longer threaten, manipulate, or control anyone in the community. That evening, Mia and I walked through the neighborhood together. The street felt different, now lighter, calmer, yet stronger. Lights glimmered from homes, neighbors exchanged stories, and a shared sense of relief hung in the air. We paused on the porch of our home, watching as life returned to normal. The battle had been won not just through legal means, but through strategy, preparation, and unity. The neighborhood had reclaimed its power, and the lessons learned would endure. Mia rested her head on my shoulder. "It's finally done," she whispered. I nodded. "Yes, and we've shown them what can happen when people stand together. Fear no longer rules here." For the first time in months, we felt the full weight of relief. Carver's reign of intimidation had ended, and the neighborhood's resilience had proven stronger than any threat. In the quiet of the evening, with lights glowing warmly across the street, it was clear that justice was not only in motion, it had been achieved. With Carver officially restrained and facing multiple charges, the neighborhood finally began the process of healing and rebuilding. Fear no longer dictated daily life. Instead, residents were focused on restoring their sense of security and community. Mia and I spent our mornings walking the streets, checking in with neighbors, listening to concerns, and ensuring that everyone understood the steps being taken to prevent future intimidation. Conversations flowed easily now, without hesitation or whispered warnings. The change was tangible and uplifting. We organized a series of neighborhood meetings, focusing on security, community planning, and mutual support. Residents shared their experiences, not just of harassment, but of resilience. They recounted moments when they stood firm, helped each other document incidents, or simply offered moral support. Each story reinforced the idea that power came from unity, and that Carver's attempts to isolate them had failed spectacularly. Mia guided these discussions with her usual calm authority, ensuring that meetings remained productive, empowering, and focused on the future. Meanwhile, the legal process against Carver moved forward. Law enforcement continued to review evidence, and additional witnesses came forward, strengthening the case. His repeated attempts to intimidate residents after the initial charges only worked to build a stronger narrative against him. Each threat, each trespass, and every false claim documented by neighbors became a piece of the puzzle. Carver's credibility deteriorated further, and the courts made it clear that he would be held accountable for his actions. The community also began implementing practical measures to safeguard their homes and families. Security cameras were installed on shared streets, doorbell cameras became more common, and a formal neighborhood watch schedule was established. Neighbors coordinated patrols and check-ins, sharing updates and alerts through a group messaging system. The emphasis was on prevention, but also on empowerment. Residents were now active participants in protecting their community rather than passive victims of intimidation. Amid these developments, life slowly returned to a sense of normalcy. Children played in yards, neighbors chatted freely on sidewalks, and the tension that had hung over the streets for months finally dissipated. The physical presence of fear was gone, replaced by a quiet confidence and mutual respect. For many residents, it was the first time they had felt truly safe in months. and they were eager to maintain that sense of security through collective action. Mia and I also took time to check in with those most affected by Carver's harassment. Hollis, the young couple, and the single mother, all of whom had been targets of direct intimidation, were now thriving in their homes. Their confidence had grown, and their ability to respond to threats had strengthened. Each expressed gratitude not just for the legal protection, but for the guidance and support that had helped them reclaim control of their lives. It was a validation of every late night, every surveillance check, and every strategic decision we had made together. Carver, meanwhile, appeared increasingly isolated. Rumors circulated that his influence within the HOA had been permanently diminished, and former allies avoided association with him. Even his attempts to undermine residents through legal loopholes failed because the community had meticulously documented every incident. The man who had once commanded fear now faced the consequences of his actions, and the neighborhood watched with quiet satisfaction as the system of accountability finally began to take effect. As weeks passed, the neighborhood began to celebrate small victories. Residents painted fences, repaired damaged property, and shared meals in the streets. The community had transformed from one under siege to one of empowerment. Every shared success reinforced the lesson that unity and preparation were more powerful than fear or intimidation. Mia and I took quiet pride in seeing the residents flourish, knowing that their confidence and resilience were now lasting assets. One evening, Mia and I walked through the neighborhood together, observing the peaceful streets and brightly lit homes. The sense of accomplishment was palpable. "It feels different now," she said softly, squeezing my hand. "It feels like they finally have control again." I nodded. "Yes, and they've learned something invaluable. Fear can be confronted, and when people stand together, no one can intimidate them." By the end of the week, the neighborhood had fully embraced its new sense of autonomy. Carver's influence was no longer a shadow over the streets, and residents were actively involved in maintaining their security, their community, and their confidence. The battle against intimidation had not only ended in legal victory, but had also transformed the residents themselves. They were stronger, more connected, and better prepared for any challenge that might arise in the future. Mia and I returned home that evening, sitting quietly on the porch. The lights from the neighborhood shimmered across the street, and for the first time in months, everything felt at peace. Carver's reign of fear had ended, and the residents had reclaimed not just their streets, but their power, their pride, and their confidence. The community had been tested, and had emerged stronger than ever. With Carver sidelined and the legal process firmly underway, the neighborhood entered a new phase, one of empowerment and rebuilding. Residents were no longer waiting for threats to pass or for protection from external forces. They were actively creating the kind of community they wanted to live in. Streets that had once felt tense and hostile now buzzed with activity. Children played freely. Neighbors greeted one another without hesitation, and casual conversations replaced whispers of fear. The change was remarkable and deeply satisfying. Mia and I continued to guide residents, offering advice on security and collaboration while encouraging support. We helped them organize community meetings to establish clear communication channels and shared responsibilities. A neighborhood watch was formalized, patrol schedules were established, and emergency protocols were put in place. Residents learned to respond efficiently to any suspicious activity, documenting it while staying safe. Every member of the community felt included, empowered, and accountable. The sheriff's office maintained close contact, following up on the evidence we had compiled and monitoring Carver's compliance with restraining orders. Each reported incident added to the growing case file, reinforcing the narrative that Carver had been using intimidation, harassment, and impersonation to exert control. Even small provocations from him now only strengthened the case. The legal system, once slow to respond, was now firmly aligned with the neighborhood's collective voice. As the weeks progressed, residents began focusing on positive community building. Block parties, shared yard work, and neighborhood cleanups created an environment of collaboration and camaraderie. Mia encouraged participation, reminding everyone that the strongest defense was a united community. People who had once been isolated or fearful were now interacting confidently, building friendships and mutual trust. The lessons learned from confronting Carver extended beyond security. They were about leadership, courage, and the power of standing together. Carver, predictably, continued to fume in isolation. His attempts to regain influence through the HOA were blocked by law enforcement and by former allies who refused to support him. He had become a cautionary tale, a man whose reign of fear collapsed the moment a community refused to be intimidated. Residents no longer whispered about him in fear. They spoke openly about their victories, their resilience, and the lessons they had learned from standing up together. One afternoon, Mia and I walked the neighborhood, checking in with residents and sharing updates on Carver's legal proceedings. The street was alive with activity, children laughing in yards, couples tending gardens, and neighbors exchanging friendly waves. It was a stark contrast to the tense, fearful environment that had dominated for so long. I realized that the transformation was not only physical. It was emotional and psychological. The residents had reclaimed their confidence, and their empowerment would endure far beyond Carver's presence. Hollis and several other residents approached us with gratitude, expressing how much their sense of safety and control had improved. "It's like a weight has been lifted," one neighbor said. "We finally feel like we own our street again." Mia smiled, her eyes reflecting the same pride I felt. "You all earned it," she replied. "You stood together, documented the truth, and refused to be intimidated. That's why this community is stronger than ever." Even as the legal process continued, the neighborhood focused on long-term resilience. Residents organized workshops on conflict resolution, security awareness, and neighborhood solidarity. Every person understood that empowerment was ongoing. It wasn't a single victory, but a sustained effort to maintain safety, unity, and confidence. The lessons from the months of intimidation had created a foundation that could withstand future challenges. By nightfall, the streets were calm, illuminated by the warm glow of porch lights. Families settled into their homes, and a sense of peace pervaded the neighborhood. Mia and I stood on our porch, observing the change we had helped facilitate. "Look at them," she said softly, nodding toward the houses across the street. "They've taken control back." I nodded, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment. "Yes. And they've learned that fear only has power if you allow it. They won't allow it again." The neighborhood had been tested, and it had emerged stronger, wiser, and more connected. Carver's attempts at control had failed, but the true victory was not in legal consequences alone, it was in the empowerment, resilience, and unity of every resident. They had reclaimed their streets, their confidence, and their sense of community, and they would carry those lessons forward. As Mia rested her head on my shoulder, I realized that this was more than just the end of a struggle. It was the beginning of a new chapter for the neighborhood, one built on trust, courage, and collective strength. The streets were quiet, but the spirit of the community had never been louder. Carver had been defeated, and the residents had learned that together they were unstoppable. The neighborhood had changed in ways that went far beyond security cameras and restraining orders. Residents who had once been hesitant, cautious, or fearful now walked the streets with confidence. Children played freely, laughter echoed across yards, and neighbors exchanged greetings without hesitation. The streets, once a landscape of tension and intimidation, had become a vibrant community. Mia and I watched these changes with quiet pride, knowing that our efforts had helped catalyze something lasting. Community meetings continued to be a cornerstone of rebuilding trust. Residents shared stories, strategies, and insights, but also celebrated victories big and small. Each success reinforced the idea that unity was the most powerful weapon against intimidation. Mia emphasized collaboration and vigilance, but also the importance of celebrating progress. The residents began to see themselves, not just as individuals fighting fear, but as a united front capable of facing challenges together. Carver's influence was now nearly non-existent. His repeated attempts to intimidate or disrupt had backfired repeatedly, reinforcing the legal case against him and demonstrating to neighbors that fear no longer worked. Former allies abandoned him, recognizing the futility of supporting someone who had lost control. Rumors circulated about his growing isolation, and even those who had previously feared him now saw him as powerless. The man who once ruled through intimidation had become a cautionary tale, a stark reminder of what happens when fear meets preparedness and collective courage. Residents, emboldened by their newfound empowerment, began taking proactive steps to strengthen their neighborhood. Block parties, shared yard work, and neighborhood cleanups became common. These activities were about more than aesthetics. They were symbols of unity, mutual support, and resilience. The streets were alive with conversation, collaboration, and camaraderie. People who had once been divided by fear were now bound together by shared experience and determination. Mia and I continued our evening walks, checking in on neighbors and observing the transformation. Each house seemed to radiate confidence. Each interaction reflected the empowerment that had replaced fear. Hollis, the young couple, and the single mother who had been directly threatened by Carver, now spoke freely and confidently, serving as examples for others in the community. Their courage had inspired the neighborhood, and their leadership reinforced the lessons learned from confronting intimidation together. The legal process continued in parallel, with Carver facing mounting consequences for his actions. Each new filing, each restraining order, and each official notice reinforced the idea that the law would no longer tolerate harassment and intimidation. But beyond legal measures, the community itself had become a deterrent. Any attempt by Carver to regain influence would now be met with coordinated resistance, documentation, and immediate reporting. Fear had been replaced with preparation, and preparation had become strength. One evening, Mia and I sat on our porch, observing children playing across the street, neighbors sharing meals, and couples walking their dogs. The transformation was complete. The neighborhood had reclaimed its streets, its confidence, and its sense of community. Every resident had played a role in this victory, and the sense of collective accomplishment was palpable. "They've really taken control back," Mia whispered. I nodded, feeling the same quiet pride. Yes. They've learned that fear only works if you allow it, and they won't allow it again. The weeks that followed reinforced this new reality. Security measures remained in place, but they were no longer about fear, they were about empowerment and vigilance. Residents remained connected, sharing alerts, checking in on each other, and maintaining the systems that had kept Carver from regaining influence. The lessons from months of intimidation became a blueprint for long-term resilience. The community had learned not only how to protect themselves, but how to thrive together. Mia and I reflected on the journey as we walked through the neighborhood one evening. The streets were quiet but alive, filled with the energy of people who had reclaimed their lives. Every porch light, every open window, every friendly wave symbolized a victory against intimidation. Carver's threats had failed. His power had evaporated, and the neighborhood had emerged stronger, wiser, and united. As we returned home, Mia rested her head on my shoulder, and I realized that this was more than a personal victory, it was a community triumph. The struggle had forged connections, empowered residents, and created a sense of confidence that would endure. Fear had no place here anymore, and the neighborhood had proven that when people stand together, intimidation is powerless. Carver had been defeated, but the real victory belonged to the residents themselves. The weeks following Carver's downfall were filled with quiet triumph. Residents continued to reclaim their streets, and the neighborhood had transformed into a vibrant, confident community. The once tense air of fear was replaced with camaraderie, laughter, and mutual respect. Every porch light seemed brighter, every yard livelier, and every conversation carried the unmistakable tone of empowerment. Mia and I walked these streets daily, witnessing the change and feeling the satisfaction of a plan well executed. Carver, now fully isolated and facing serious legal consequences, made one last attempt to intimidate the neighborhood. A letter, unsigned but unmistakably his handwriting, was slipped under a few doors. The note warned of repercussions if the community persisted in documenting and reporting his actions. But this time, the reaction was entirely different. Residents no longer flinched or whispered. They photographed the letters, logged every detail, and reported the incident to law enforcement. What had once been a terrifying message was now evidence, further strengthening the case against him. The sheriff's office followed up promptly. Every attempt by Carver to disrupt or threaten was catalogued, and law enforcement ensured that all restraining orders and legal measures were enforced without exception. The message was clear. Carver no longer had power, and any effort to regain influence would be met with immediate consequences. Residents felt a renewed sense of security, knowing that both legal authority and community vigilance were on their side. Neighborhood meetings became celebrations of resilience. Residents shared stories of standing together, documenting incidents, and confronting fear. Mia guided these discussions, emphasizing that the real victory was not just legal, it was the empowerment and unity of the community. Every neighbor, from Hollis to the young couple to the single mother, had played a role, and their contributions were acknowledged and celebrated. This collective sense of achievement reinforced the idea that intimidation could only succeed when people allowed it. This neighborhood would never allow it again. Carver's influence within the HOA was completely dissolved. Former allies had abandoned him, recognizing that aligning with fear and manipulation was both futile and dangerous. Even his minor attempts to rally support or disrupt neighborhood activities were met with coordinated resistance and legal documentation. The man who had once dominated through fear had become powerless, a living example of what happens when intimidation encounters preparation, courage, and collective action. As the neighborhood flourished, practical measures reinforced the sense of empowerment. Security cameras, neighborhood watch schedules, and emergency protocols remained active, but they were no longer symbols of fear. They were symbols of vigilance, preparation, and community strength. Residents felt confident that even if threats arose in the future, they were equipped to respond effectively, united as a single, unshakable front. One evening, Mia and I walked through the streets, observing neighbors chatting in their yards, children playing under the soft glow of porch lights, and couples strolling without concern. The atmosphere was serene yet vibrant, a testament to months of struggle, preparation, and coordinated action. "They've really taken their streets back," Mia said softly, her eyes reflecting pride and relief. I nodded. Yes. They've learned something even more valuable than safety. They've learned that fear only has power if you allow it, and they won't allow it again. As the sun set, we paused on a quiet corner of the neighborhood. The transformation was complete. What had begun as a community under siege had evolved into a neighborhood defined by empowerment, resilience, and unity. The victory was not just against Carver, but for every resident who had faced fear and refused to yield. The lessons of courage, documentation, collaboration, and steadfastness would endure far beyond the legal resolution of the case. The final days leading to Carver's court appearance were calm but purposeful. Residents continued documenting, reporting, and supporting one another. The sheriff's office confirmed that the case against Carver was strong, with a comprehensive record of harassment, intimidation, impersonation, and trespassing. Legal consequences were inevitable, and the neighborhood could now observe without fear as the system of accountability took its course. Mia and I returned home one evening, sitting quietly on our porch as lights flickered across the street. The streets were calm, yet the vibrancy and strength of the community were unmistakable. The battle against intimidation was over. Carver had been defeated legally, socially, and emotionally. But the true victory belonged to the residents themselves, who had learned to confront fear, support one another, and reclaim their power. As Mia rested her head on my shoulder, I realized that this journey had been about more than defeating a single man. It had been about transforming a community, forging connections, and teaching lessons that would endure for generations. Carver's reign of fear was gone, replaced by a neighborhood that stood united, confident, and unshakable. The streets that once echoed with tension now thrummed with life, safety, and empowerment. The final victory was not just the end of Carver's intimidation, it was the beginning of a stronger, wiser, and united community. With Carver facing inevitable legal consequences, the neighborhood entered a new era. The streets were no longer a place of fear. They had become a symbol of resilience, community, and empowerment. Residents walked with confidence, children played freely, and neighbors exchanged greetings and laughter. The transformation was profound, the result of months of courage, vigilance, and coordinated action. Mia and I walked the streets often, observing the change with quiet satisfaction, knowing that the neighborhood had reclaimed not only its safety, but its sense of self. Carver's court proceedings proceeded smoothly. Every documented act of harassment, intimidation, impersonation, and trespassing was presented, leaving him with little room to defend himself. The evidence compiled by residents' photos, videos, timelines, and witness statements formed an unshakable case. For the first time, Carver experienced the consequences of his actions fully and publicly. The man who had once wielded fear as a weapon was powerless, accountable, and unable to manipulate the neighborhood he had tried to control. The neighborhood, however, no longer focused solely on Carver. The emphasis shifted to maintaining security, fostering relationships, and building a lasting sense of community. Block parties, shared yard projects, and neighborhood watch programs became regular activities. These were more than social events, they were statements of solidarity, symbols of empowerment, and practical demonstrations of preparedness. Residents now understood that vigilance and collaboration were lifelong commitments, not temporary measures. Mia and I continued to guide and support the community, helping neighbors refine communication channels, emergency plans, and monitoring systems. The emphasis was on sustainability, ensuring that the lessons learned from Carver's harassment would remain ingrained and that future challenges could be met with confidence. The residents, once isolated and fearful, had become a network of support, ready to face adversity together. Even the youngest members of the neighborhood learned the value of unity and resilience. Children observed their parents documenting incidents, communicating clearly, and standing firm. They saw firsthand that courage and preparation could overcome fear, and that working together created strength. The lessons extended beyond immediate safety. They became a blueprint for confidence, responsibility, and leadership that would shape the community for years to come. As Carver's final court date approached, the atmosphere in the neighborhood was calm but anticipatory. Residents followed the proceedings closely, confident that justice would be served. Legal outcomes aside, the true victory had already been achieved. Fear no longer dictated behavior. Intimidation no longer held sway. Every resident had learned to stand tall, document carefully, and act collectively. Carver's attempts to divide, manipulate, and control had failed utterly. On the evening before the court's final ruling, Mia and I walked slowly through the neighborhood. The streets were quiet, but alive with a sense of accomplishment. Porch lights glimmered, children's laughter echoed faintly, and neighbors waved as we passed. It was a peaceful scene, yet the vibrancy and strength of the community were unmistakable. "It feels different now," Mia whispered. "It feels like freedom." I nodded. Yes. Freedom, but also strength. They've reclaimed their streets and their confidence, and they'll never give it up again. The following day, the court delivered its judgment. Carver faced multiple charges with full accountability. Legal consequences were imposed, and restraining orders ensured he could no longer threaten the neighborhood. The residents watched with quiet satisfaction, not just because of the legal outcome, but because they knew the true victory was theirs, the victory of courage, unity, and preparedness. Carver's reign of fear had ended, but the empowerment of the neighborhood would endure. After the court proceedings, the neighborhood celebrated not with fanfare, but with a quiet, profound sense of relief and achievement. Residents shared stories of their experiences, reflected on the lessons learned, and strengthened connections that had grown over months of adversity. The bonds formed through shared struggle had become the foundation of lasting community resilience. Mia and I walked among them, proud to witness the transformation. As night fell, we returned to our porch, looking out at the quiet streets. The lights from the homes glimmered softly, reflecting the spirit of a community that had faced fear and refused to yield. Carver's threats, intimidation, and control were behind them. The lessons learned, the unity forged, and the empowerment achieved would remain. Mia rested her head on my shoulder, and I felt a deep sense of closure. The neighborhood was no longer under siege, it was alive, confident, and unshakable. The journey had been long and challenging, but the conclusion was clear. Fear could be confronted, intimidation could be neutralized, and communities could reclaim their power through preparation, courage, and unity. Carver had been defeated, but the real victory belonged to the residents, the people who had stood together, documented the truth, and refused to be intimidated. The neighborhood had transformed from a place of fear into a model of resilience, strength, and empowerment. As we watched the streets grow quiet, the sense of accomplishment was profound. Carver's chapter had ended, but the community's story was only beginning. A new era had arrived, one defined not by fear, but by courage, collaboration, and the knowledge that together they were unstoppable. For the first time in months, the neighborhood could breathe freely, and the glow of safety, pride, and unity filled every home. The residents had not only reclaimed their streets, they had reclaimed their lives.